There's a strange moment that can happen as your parents get older. You call with a problem and realize you're no longer calling because you expect them to solve it. You visit the house you've known for decades, and somehow it doesn't feel quite as much like going home. Or you find yourself explaining something, arranging something, checking something for the person who used to do those things for you. Your parents are still here, and yet something has already been lost. Because sometimes the first thing you lose isn't a person. It's the role they used to occupy in your life. And that may be only the first of several quiet losses no one really tells you to expect. For most of your life, your parents have occupied a position that feels almost permanent, not necessarily as the people who control your life. That may have ended decades ago, but as the generation above you, the people who knew the world before you entered it. The people who might remember the name of your second grade teacher, or the car your family had when you were 6, or exactly what happened that Thanksgiving nobody tells the story about anymore. Even when you're 50 years old, there can still be someone who remembers you at 5. And you don't necessarily notice how much that position means until it begins to change. Maybe dad starts calling you before making decisions he once would have made without thinking. Maybe mom hands you a letter and asks what it means. Maybe something breaks in the house, and instead of watching your father walk toward the problem, you notice him looking toward you. None of these moments has to be dramatic. That's exactly what makes them easy to miss. Nothing has officially happened. There was no announcement that the roles were changing. But slowly, you become the person who knows what to do, and they become the people asking. That can create an emotion that's surprisingly difficult to name, because helping them may feel completely natural. You may be glad you can do it. But underneath the practical task, something else can be happening. The direction of care has begun to reverse, and that changes more than who makes the phone call. It can change where you feel you stand in your own family. For decades, adulthood may have meant building your own life while still knowing there was another layer behind you. You had responsibilities. Maybe children, a career, a mortgage, a divorce, people depending on you. But your parents were still your parents. There was still, somewhere in the structure of your life, a generation above you. And when that structure begins to change, you can feel strangely exposed. Not because you suddenly became an adult. You did that a long time ago. It's because one of the last places where you didn't have to be entirely the adult may be disappearing. And sometimes you feel that most clearly when you go home. For years, walking through your parents' front door could do something peculiar to time. The furniture might have changed. The neighborhood might have changed. You certainly had. But some part of you still knew your position there. Maybe you went straight to the refrigerator without asking. Maybe your mother still tried to send food home with you. Maybe your father asked about the drive as though you hadn't been driving for 35 years. Small things. But together, they created a kind of home, base. Not necessarily a perfect home. Not necessarily even an easy one. Just a place where your history was already known. Then, gradually, you begin noticing that the place is still there, but the feeling has changed. Maybe visits now involve checking medications, fixing the television, sorting mail, driving somewhere, repeating instructions, or noticing things around the house that your parents would once have noticed before you did. You haven't stopped being their child, but you may no longer get to experience being their child in quite the same way. And that is a loss, a peculiar one, because there may be nothing visibly missing. Same house, same kitchen, same people, different feeling. But the loss of that home base reveals something even less obvious. You're not only losing things your parents used to do, you may also begin losing certain answers. Every family has knowledge that exists almost nowhere except inside particular people. Who was that neighbor? Why did Grandpa stop speaking to his brother? What year did we take that trip? Was I always like this? What happened when I was too young to remember? For a long time, you assume those answers are simply available. Then one day, you ask a question and get a different answer than you expected. I don't remember. Or the story is harder to retrieve. Or the conversation that once would have lasted an hour ends after a few sentences. And sometimes the missing answer isn't factual at all. It's emotional. You tell your father something because you already know the kind of response he'll give. Except this time, he doesn't. You tell your mother something because you want that familiar mixture of concern, irritation, and reassurance you've heard your whole life. But the response is different now. Maybe their energy has changed. Maybe their priorities have changed. Maybe they simply aren't the same people they were 20 years ago. None of us are. And that points to another loss hidden inside all of this. You can lose a version of someone while continuing to have a relationship with the person they are now. The father who could spend all Saturday working outside. The mother who somehow knew what everyone in the family was doing. The parent who argued with you about everything. The one who called too often. The one who never seemed tired. Even the traits that once irritated you can feel different when they begin to disappear. Because aging doesn't only change the future, it can change your relationship to the past. You begin to realize that some experiences you thought were simply part of having parents actually belong to a particular era. And that era ended without telling you it was ending. There was a last time your dad drove the whole family somewhere. You probably didn't know it was the last time. A last holiday your mother handled the way she always had. A last time you called one of them for a certain kind of advice. A last time you arrived and felt, without thinking about it, that they were taking care of everything. Most of these moments don't announce themselves. They only become endings in retrospect. And this can be especially complicated if your relationship with your parents was never simple. Because not everyone is watching an idealized childhood slowly disappear. Some people had distant parents, critical parents, parents who were difficult to understand, parents with whom love and frustration have always occupied the same room. And aging doesn't magically resolve that history. Sometimes it makes it more complicated. You may feel tenderness and resentment in the same week. Protectiveness towards someone who once made you feel unprotected. Sadness about losing a closeness you had. Or sadness about realizing that a closeness you wanted may never arrive in the form you imagined. That is another kind of loss. Not losing what existed. Losing the possibility that it might someday become different. And perhaps this is why these experiences can feel so strange. We tend to recognize loss when there is a line, before and after, here and gone. But many of the losses that come with aging parents don't give you a line. They give you a series of ordinary afternoons. A phone call that feels slightly different. A task you now handle. A question they can no longer answer in quite the same way. A house that is still home, but not in the same way it used to be. Nothing tells you that you're allowed to experience any of this as loss, because the people themselves are still here. So you may dismiss the feeling. You may tell yourself you're being dramatic or ungrateful. After all, you can still call them. You can still visit. You can still sit across from them. And all of that is true, but it doesn't make the changes imaginary. Presence and loss are not always opposites. Sometimes they occupy the same room. You can be grateful your mother is sitting across from you and still miss something about who she used to be. You can help your father with something and still feel the absence of the man who once helped you. You can love the relationship you have now and still notice that another version of it has ended. Recognizing that doesn't require turning every visit into a meditation on mortality. In fact, it may do the opposite. Because if you insist that nothing has been lost until someone is gone, you can miss what is actually happening in the relationship right now. You may keep comparing your parents to who they used to be, waiting for an old response, expecting an old role, returning to an old version of home, and feeling confused every time reality doesn't match it. But once you recognize that some chapters of the relationship really have ended, you can begin seeing the chapter you're actually in. Your role may be different now. So may theirs. There may be things they can no longer give you. There may also be things you can know about them now that you couldn't know when they were busy being the authority, the provider, the problem solver, the parent. Maybe you begin seeing the person inside the role more clearly, their limitations, their fears, their stories, their contradictions, maybe even their need for you. That doesn't erase what has changed. It doesn't need to. Because perhaps the strangest part of watching your parents get older is discovering that loss doesn't always wait for absence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, while everyone is still sitting at the table. The person is there. The relationship is there. The love, if it was there, may still be there. But certain roles, certain answers, certain versions of home, certain versions of them, and certain versions of you with them may already belong to another time. And maybe that strange feeling you couldn't quite explain wasn't you imagining something that hadn't happened yet. Maybe something had happened. Something small had ended, and no one had given you a name for it.